How's everyone doing today? All right, I'm going to try to wear this microphone, but I'll try to speak loud because let's see how this goes. I'm going to take my glasses off. All right, that might help a little bit.
There you go.
Plug her in here. I think we're good to go. All right. So, once again, my name is Tony Vorwald. I work for Jackson County Conservation. I'm going to talk to you about some of the native prairies here in Jackson County. To start things off, I want to introduce myself a little bit, so I'm not a stranger if you don't know me well. So, I grew up on a small farm in between Zwingle and Bernard, Iowa, so I'm fairly local. I went to high school in Cascade, not Maquoketa, so don't hold it against me. I grew up a pretty outdoorsy kid, doing a lot of hunting, kayaking, fishing, things like that, which led me to wanting to go to school for natural resources stuff. So I started off my college career at Hawkeye Community College, which has a really good 2-year natural resources program. That eventually led me to the University of Dubuque, where I got my bachelor's in environmental science, and I just finished up my master's degree in integrated natural resources management, and I currently work for Jackson County Conservation. I worked up in Minnesota and Wisconsin for a while, but came back to this area. And also another cool thing about myself is I just got married this past summer. So yeah, look at that. All to someone who used to work for Jackson County Conservation. That's how we met. So today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics of all time, and that's the tall grass prairie. I'm like a bona fide plant nerd. When it comes to native plants, I've kind of ran with it in a big way. So I absolutely love native plants, and especially the native grasslands that are here in Iowa. So the tall grass prairie is an ecosystem. It's a group of plants and animals found here in the central part of the United States, historically. So there's some characteristic plants that are involved with the tall grass prairie, characteristic animals that we consider characteristic to the tall grass prairie, and just really, really cool stuff. The tall grass prairie is also known for some big disturbances naturally, and we're talking pre-settlement, or settlement times pre-settlement to about as far back as following the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago. Natural wildfires or human-set fires, large disturbances by large land animal grazers like the bison and elk that we had here in Iowa and essentially in the part of the United States at one time. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the native oak savannas that are here, were here naturally in the Midwest. I might use the term prairie and savanna interchangeably during this program. They're intermixed, they're part of the same overall picture. So if I want to back up really quick, I'm used to talking to elementary age school kids a lot of the time. I'm super excited to be here talking to adults. I'm also really good at talking too fast and like getting jumbled. So if I start going, just raise your hand, slow me down, and I'll repeat anything you want me to repeat. Also, if there's any questions at all during this, raise your hand and I'll do my best to answer questions. All right, so back to the oak savanna. The oak savanna is basically an ecosystem where the prairie and the eastern woodlands meet. We hear the term savanna when we're talking about like Animal Planet in Africa, an African savanna, but the United States had a form of savanna as well, mostly dominated by, it's kind of like a mixture of grassland and hardwood deciduous forests, oaks, some hickories, a lot of sunlight, all branched out, and also with plants and animals that you kind of find both in the prairie, both in the woodlands, and some that are almost unique to the savanna as well. So here is a map of the central United States. There's a few different colors here, and these different colors represent different types of prairie ecosystems. Here in the east, oops, back her up, there we go. Here in the east where the green is, that's where the tall grass prairie ecosystem naturally occurs. That's the wettest of the prairie ecosystems that we have in the United States. The orange in the middle, we're getting drier. We call it the mixed grass prairie. And the red is dry grass prairie. or not, or dry grass prairie, or short grass prairie. And then once you get past that, you get desert and mountains and stuff like that. So the mountains, the Rocky Mountains create a rain shadow. Weather comes in from the west, dumps most of its rain on the western side of the mountains. The eastern side of the mountains are dry, but as storm system and weather moves across, moves across the United States, it drops more precipitation. I'm going to do that 100 times. And then over dry, a little bit wetter, eastern United States, way wetter, and we had historically more woodlands. All right, so here in Iowa, we had prairies. Iowa used to be, at the time of European settlement, say 1830s and 1870s, the entire landmass of Iowa was about 80 to 85% tall grass prairie. Iowa is about, when it comes to native prairie that was not converted into something else, is about 0.01% prairie. So not much prairie at all. So we pretty much lost a big chunk, or most of our remnant prairie here in Iowa. So here is another map. I'm a plant nerd, I'm a map nerd. So here is the great state of Iowa, which we are currently in. And we have a few more colors here. This is a pretty simple map, kind of reduced for simplicity. But these colors represent different stuff. The yellow represents where the prairie was at the time of European settlement. The green along the rivers represents where there was forests or savannas at the time of the European settlement. So looking at that map, Iowa used to be mostly entirely prairie. The thing that's really cool is we know where these areas were because of knowledge from the indigenous people who live in our area. Also early settlers, early land surveyors, journals, things like that. And also early explorers, painters. Here is a picture of a painting by a fellow named George Catlin, who traveled across the Midwest and the western United States throughout the mid-1800s. And he did a lot of landscapes, he did a lot of portraits of Native Americans, and he did paintings of this area when he was in the Midwest during the 1830s. So this is a painting George Catlin did of what is now Dubuque. You take out a few landmarks on here that might kind of picture in your mind what Dubuque looks like now. Right here, it's not a stone tower in this painting because back in when it first was erected, it was made out of wood. But does anyone know? You can kind of see this little structure with a cross on top of it, on top of this hill. Does anyone know what that is?
Julia Dubuque.
Julia Dubuque's grave. Yep. So back when it was wood. And then down here we see a few structures, maybe a cabin. There's a big house. This is Mississippi River right here. So this is where Dubuque currently resides. And what we're seeing here in George Catlin's painting is the hills of Dubuque, and you have what is prairie and savanna. You have lots of grasses and a few widespread spread out trees, which are probably oak hickory trees as well. Here's where Dubuque's probably sitting now. We channelized the river, water went down, so Hy-Vee is probably sitting right here, and then Shot Tower's over here, and then a few other landmarks. Mines of Spain, state recreation area right there. And up the valley you have like Murphy Park and things like that. So here is, this is a little bit outdated map, but here is land cover, the land cover map of Iowa in modern day, more or less. This is 2002 data, but it's fairly much the same. We have a few different colors, but we have kind of this brown color, which is row crop agriculture. As I grew up in a farm, I'm sure a lot of us have a farming background. Iowa is an agricultural state, right? So we have row crop agriculture. The green, a light green is like pasture grassland. Purple, towns, and the dark green is forests. So we have a big land conversion from the time the settlers came here to now. Iowa is about 35.7 million acres landmass. Originally is about 28.6 million acres prairie, and now we have about 30.6 million acres of agriculture. That number kind of comes from 2019 data. So besides agriculture, our land was converted into urban areas. Here is downtown Des Moines Metro, and if you're driving around, we all know towns, we all know what town development looks like. And also another thing that kind of transitioned our prairies into something else is areas where there are still prairie. It's things like woody encroachment and invasive species. This is not Iowa. This is a picture from South Dakota, but the picture is very much the same when it comes to our prairies. I'll touch more on it later and a few more times, but the prairie as an ecosystem is a disturbance-dependent ecosystem. It means it needs things like fire and grazing to keep it a prairie. Or else you start getting other things like shrubs and some trees and invasive species coming in. So one of the things we deal with in our prairies is cedar encroachment. This is eastern red cedar, which is a native species of tree. We had it here naturally, natively, but without the presence of the fire or the grazers or someone taking it out, cedars love sunlight and they can take over a prairie in what's a matter of decades. So, why do we care about prairies? I care about prairies in a big, big way. Here's a list that I kind of threw together. You can take it in a million different directions. One I think is beautiful, but kind of a list that I put together is habitat, wildlife habitat, native plants, animals, insects that are from Iowa. Most of them found their habitat in the prairie. Their homes where they get their food, water, shelter, space, everything. Biodiversity, and that word means the number of plants and animals. Prairies are a very diverse ecosystem. So the number of plants and animals found in prairie is staggering. When you think of like diverse ecosystems, we're talking like environmental science stuff, we hear a lot about like the Amazon rainforest, which is considered one of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth, but at a smaller scale, the tallgrass prairie is more diverse than the Amazon rainforest. As a total, Amazon rainforest is a little more diverse than tallgrass prairie, but if you shrink it down to a meter squared, tallgrass prairie is more diverse. Pretty cool. Also, flood control, perennial grasses, deep roots, prevent erosion, water quality. These plants and deep roots also uptake nutrients, stop soil from getting to waterways, they aid in chemical uptake, ways that water quality helps. Iowa has awesome soil, as I'm sure most of us know. Iowa's soil, largely in part, is so good from the organic matter of the tallgrass prairie existing since the last ice age, living and dying, putting all that organic matter into the soil, creating that soil, and which gives us the superb farmland that we have today. And where there is perennial vegetation, that soil is still being regenerated or created. Carbon sequestration, so carbon dioxide from the atmosphere getting put into plants, into organic matter, into the soil. Also, a big part for me, why I care about prairies, is education. Education for students, education for public, and also recreation. People who like to hunt, people who like bird watching, people like me who like to look at flowers and go hiking. Things like that. So one thing when we're talking about how we had a lot of prairie and now we don't have a lot of prairie is we talk a lot about that in relation to biodiversity loss or the loss of plants and animals off of our landscape. And I'm not going to get too doom and gloom here today, but kind of a figure, since 1970, we've lost about 53% of our grassland species birds from that conversion of natural landscapes to more developed landscapes. I mean, the list can go on and on, but I don't want this to be too set of a presentation. One thing I really want to touch on and go back to is how the prairie's roots, and that has really helped create our soil, hold our soil in place. So this is a picture of a native grass called big blue stem, and big blue stem and other native prairie plants and grasses have insanely deep root systems, like very, very deep. This is probably maybe a 5-foot, 6-foot, 8-foot root system, and they kind of attempt to drive it home is this place in Cedar Falls called Tallgrass Prairie Center, and they do a lot of work with prairie education and roots, and I bought this from them. Oop, wrong way. So here is a 2-scale photo of the root system. There we go. Big blue stem. So this is taller than me. I'm 6'5". This is probably 7 foot deep. So prairie plants in general, super deep root systems, which creates fantastic soil and creates awesome soil health, all the microorganisms that live in the soil that we don't think about too much that aid in the fertility and health of our soil. So, lay it down, try to trip on it. So moving on, here, so I work for Jackson County Conservation. I do a lot of work with prairie stuff. And in the prairie world, we talk about remnant prairies versus restored prairies. And it's kind of evident a little bit, but prairie restoration is an area where you have land that is currently not in prairie, and then you plant it into native prairie plants. So here's a picture of one of our prairie replantings, and we're not going to talk too much about prairie restoration today necessarily, but an area that was probably a lawn or a crop field that was then put back into native plants. Here's some more pictures of some more restored prairies here in Jackson County. Here is where my office is, the Hurstville Interpretive Center, with these beautiful purple flowers, which are, those are spiderwort. And remnant prairies are areas that, for whatever reason, were never converted into an urban area or into agriculture. It's a spot that was a prairie at the time of European settlement and is still a prairie. Though Iowa is only 0.01% remnant prairie today, there are still spots of remnant prairie. In Jackson County, we do have a number of remnant prairie sites, and they are absolutely spectacular. So remnant prairies are, compared to restored prairies, a lot more diverse than restored prairies. The remnant prairies have a lot of plants that are hard, and seeds are hard to harvest, so you're not going to find them in seed mixes and prairie seed mixes when you're planting stuff again. So yeah, the remnant prairies that we have here in Jackson County are remnant prairies because usually they were too steep and rocky to ever be farmed or raised. Or they were too wet to be farmed. So most of them steep, rocky. They kept a southwest sun exposure, which kept them super dry, which prevented trees from encroaching on them necessarily. And maybe some of these places were also old pasturing. Grazing, to a certain extent, is something that a prairie needs to keep it a prairie. So remnant prairies, they're important. They're super ecologically diverse. They have high wildlife habitat value, high pollinator. We're talking about insects, bees, butterflies, things that pollinate plants. Water infiltration, so when you have a heavy rainstorm, that water that falls onto that landscape gets absorbed and utilized by the prairie instead of running off into a river or creating erosion. Flood control, soil retention, so on and so forth. So one thing that I do is I do a lot of work on the remnant prairies that Jackson County manages and helping identify where some of these remnant prairie sites are. There's a few ways that I do that. One is people tell me that's where they're at. So people know where they're at necessarily in some cases. Also historic aerial photos. The US government took aerial photos of pretty much the entire United States starting in the 1930s. And now we have satellite imagery, but we can look at some areas dating back to like 1930s, and you can kind of see what that landscape looked like back then. Another one is using a LiDAR. LiDAR is an interesting tool and technology. LiDAR is sort of like light radar. You have a plane flying over the land. It shoots light down onto the ground. That light bounces back and it creates an image. And I'll show you a few of these pictures here in a little bit. And with LiDAR, I can really tell if an area was ever converted into, say, agriculture or not. Also, there's indicator plant species. There are some plants that you just don't really see anywhere else besides a remnant prairie. So if they're there, there's a lot of them, another good indicator that there's remnant prairie. So here is some historic aerial photography. This is one of our wildlife areas. This is out at Ozark Wildlife Area. Here, this isn't 1930s necessarily, but it's the 1950s picture. Here in red, I outlined where is remnant prairie and savanna on that site. So we're looking at our 1950s. There was very steep, very rocky, but it was still pretty much an open prairie system at that time. Here's that LiDAR picture, that light radar. So it's roughly the same area. Actually, it is the same area. So here is an old farmstead down there. and that'll be sitting right here. So it's the same area, but there's all these different colors and textures and stuff. Do you all see how like some of this is like looks bumpy and textured? That's unplowed land. You see how some of these spots are really smooth looking? That's where agriculture is. Corn, soybeans are now or once were. So once you till up land, it smooths it out, and it'll create this smooth looking image on the LiDAR layer. And another way, going out to these sites where it's still open and identifying plants, looking for those indicator species. So what a big part of what we do with our remnant and restored prairies is manage them. And a big part of managing them is recreating those disturbances that were naturally here. So we don't have the bison anymore in Iowa. We don't have the elk anymore in Iowa. So I get to act as that group. I'm not actually chewing the grasses, but might mow it if it's a spot where I can safely put a mower on. Another one is physically taking a chainsaw and cutting out unwanted woody or invasive species, probably chemically treating them so they don't re-sprout. A lot of our woody species and invasive species we have in prairies, if I cut it with a chainsaw and walk away, next year I'm going to show up where there was one stem that I cut, there's going to be like 20 of them. It's a kind of response, a plant's response to being grazed or whatever. But it becomes more of a mess, so I dab the cut with a specific chemical, hopefully it kills it. Also seeding down certain areas in native forbs, native flowers, and monitoring, watching what happens, see how the prairies respond to management, so on and so forth. Here is some pictures of a crew that I had this last summer on one of our remnant areas. So this area that we're looking at was remnant prairie, even up to about 20 years ago. And unfortunately, sometimes as a department, we don't have enough money or time or staff to give these areas the proper management they need, and they get converted into invasive species, unwanted woody species. So this spot is all these little trees, these little maples that were on a remnant prairie site that still has prairie integrity to it, and we're cutting them out. We're getting rid of them. Hopefully that will turn it over time and proper management back into a prairie system. Prescribed fire is a tool that we use. The prairie is a very fire-dependent ecosystem. It was caused naturally in the summertime by lightning strikes, also by Native Americans would intentionally set prescribed fires. And we do the same on our prairie lands. I'm going to show you a really cool video of what it kind of looks like when we are doing a prescribed burn on a prairie site. This video is not from our crew, this is from a crew from over in Iowa City, but it does a really good job of giving a quick glimpse of what prescribed burn day looks like. A lot of time and thought and preparation when it comes to prescribed burns. It's not just lighting a match and walking away. That creates hazards, that creates danger. These are slow, boring, there should be slow, boring fires. And a slow, boring fire is a proper one. Naturally, back in the old days, wildfires would occur across the state once every year to every 10 years, keeping it a prairie system. After that, you start getting that shrubby, woody stuff coming in, turning it into a savanna or a woodland. So now I'm going to show you a few of the remnant prairie savanna sites that we have here in Jackson County on Jackson County Conservation property. So the first one is they're all my favorite, but this one is really cool. This is that Buzzard Ridge Wildlife Area. It is a remnant bluff prairie, so it's a kind of a dry, rocky prairie, and it has one of the best views in Jackson County. You can see the Maquoketa River there behind it. Pretty much most of our remnant prairies in Jackson County occur by the river, where it's really steep, where it couldn't be plowed at one point in time. So I have a few pictures here. Here is this is from 2021 aerial photo. And you can see it outlined in red where the prairie was at the time of when the land got into our management. And then here it is in 1950 aerial. So it's really big and open in the 1950s. Through not enough management or disturbance, woodies and trees encroached in. So you can kind of see how much smaller of an area that prairie is open. And one of the things that I'm doing and we're doing is trying to open it back up to get close to the original boundary, increase its integrity and all that kind of good stuff. Here's some more cool pictures of that little remnant prairie savanna in the fall. You can see some native grass starting to turn. We have really interesting native prairie shrubs like hazelnut and prairie willow. You can kind of see right here in the foreground turning colors. Here's a few pictures of some of the work days. There's me and my boss Nate out there cutting trees off the bluff to get more sunlight onto that prairie. Black Hawk Wildlife Area is another spot that has a small little remnant bluff prairie. Not very large, but it is really cool. There is some very rare plants that are found at this spot.
Where's that located? Eden Valley?
No, this is Black Hawk Wildlife Area.
Where is that?
That's west of town here. Yep, but not too far. Here's a few pictures that were taken in this. Here's one in the summer. Here's some in the early spring. I've opened up, took a lot more trees out of it. It looks a lot more open now. Once again, here is our side-by-side historical aerial view of the remnant prairies. You can see them outlined here in red. Here they look like as of last year, so a lot more closed in, a lot more encroached upon. Now to my actual favorite here is Ozark Wildlife Area out in western Jackson County. Ozark Wildlife Area has the most of our remnant prairies that we manage, and they are absolutely beautiful. They have some of the best prairie plant and savanna assemblages around. Very ecologically interesting and valuable, and also really cool and even rare animals, insects, reptiles, things like that. So here is a savanna site. This picture right here, this is like a true blue savanna. This is late June, early July, and the prairie is colorful pretty much from mid-May all the way to the first frost. But right here, kind of that 4th of July time, the colors are absolutely spectacular. In my mind, the prairie is also celebrating the 4th of July. It doesn't have fireworks, but it does have flowers. We have all these orange flowers here. We'll get to maybe a few of these plants in a little bit, but does anyone know what this orange flower is? Butterfly milkweed. Yeah, butterfly milkweed. And milkweed is famous because it's the host plant to monarch butterflies. Here in Iowa, we have 18 different species of milkweed that are native, and we only really talk about 4 of them, but we have a lot of really cool ones. And you see the amount of butterfly milkweed there. If you zoomed in, there'd be a ton more blooming plants. And it's not just this time of year. It is May all the way through October. Here is one of the steeper remnant prairies out at Ozark Wildlife Area in October. You can see this brown golden native grass that has turned out that time of year. I just think it shows its first color of the fall. So here is a couple maps. I'll show you a few different maps here at Ozark Wildlife Area. This is the west end of Ozark Wildlife Area, and once again, I outlined where there was remnant prairie in the 1950s, and here is 2021 aerial imagery. So very much converted into a woodland, right, or encroached upon. Here is that one we saw earlier, out in kind of the northern part of Ozark Wildlife Area, this area that was remnant prairie savanna. Here it is as of last year. So a lot of work that needs to be done out there to turn it back into a prairie system. But just to drive the point home, here are a few pretty pictures of what these savannas and remnant prairies look like. We have our classic wide open oak here that's characteristic of a oak savanna. Here is that savanna zoomed in. We have this beautiful purple flower. This is called the lead plant. That blooms kind of right there on the 4th of July. We have our butterfly milkweed here. We can see prairie coreopsis in the background. The list goes on and on and on. Here is an interesting plant that we find out there at those remnant prairies. This is called wood betony. It likes to grow on steep, dry slopes, kind of in a prairie savanna ecosystem. And this plant is a partial parasite to oak roots. No oaks, no wood betonies, a lot of plants that do that. They steal or borrow nutrients from other plants. So you only really find this type of plant in a remnant prairie that has some integrity to it. Here's one of our steep remnant prairies out there at Ozark Wildlife Area. This is probably early August where we have a bit change in color. August on the remnant prairies is very yellow and white. These plants that you see in the foreground, these big yellow ones, this is called large flower false foxglove. That one is a mouthful, large flower false foxglove. And this is one of these plants that's also a partial parasite to oak roots. And it is heavily utilized by pollinators. When this plant is in full bloom, the whole plant just shakes with the amount of bees that are coming in and out of it. It is insane once you see it in person. Here's some more that large flower false foxglove out there. Cool, so I touched on this a little bit, but what is Jackson County Conservation doing for our remnant prairies? In the last 4 years, we put a lot more focus on trying to do a better job of managing our remnant prairies. So one is the conservation management stuff, cutting out woodies and invasives, when it's appropriate, doing prescribed burns, engaging work crews like the Conservation Corps of Iowa, which takes freshly graduated college students, gives them a year or two of getting practical skills in land management work, contracting them out to come out here. They can learn and also work, and we benefit from that as well. Doing plant inventories, and prescribed burning. Also on these spots, we try to document the plants, especially the stuff that's like rare, the special concern stuff, the things that are special concern, threatened, or endangered species. You can see us out here doing some plant inventorying. Here is a really cool snake that we find out in our prairies. This is called the prairie ringneck snake. It's about 4 inches long as an adult. It's mostly subterranean, which means it lives in the space in the roots under the soil, so you barely see it above ground. It's this really cool little collar on it. It eats slugs and bugs and stuff, and it's beautiful. It's a part of the ecosystem. But this is one of these animals you don't really find anywhere else besides remnant prairies. This is a cool plant, and I'm not going to tell you where it's at because it's an endangered plant. But this is called this is either stiff sandwort or rock sandwort, and it only grows in a few spots across Iowa. And when I first found it, I could not figure out what the heck it was. And I sent the picture to the state botanist, Mark Luschke, and he emailed me. He's like, "Oh, you got to tell me where that's at. Send me the coordinates. I keep track of them." So only a few of us know where it's at. But this is one of these plants that you're not going to see growing anywhere else. This is a rare plant, and you only find them in special spots on the remnant prairies. Here's some cool herps, some reptiles. There's that prairie ringneck snake again. And here is our 5-line skink. Who knew Iowa had lizards? So we have a native lizard. We have multiple native lizards here in Iowa. The ones that we have in our part of the neck of the woods is called 5-line skinks, and they live in remnant prairie savanna areas. Dry, rocky, and they're really cool. You may have seen them if you're out and about on the farm or something back in the day. When they're young, they have blue tails. They're really small, and then the tails fall off if you grab them. They wiggle around. Really pretty. And my favorite animal, not everyone's favorite animal, the timber rattlesnake. There's some sites where timber rattlesnakes still exist. Timber rattlesnakes used to be everywhere in Jackson County. Now, they're not. Habitat loss, persecution. I'm sure someone's dad in here probably killed timber rattlesnakes at one point in time. But they are a protected species now, and this is a species that needs remnant dry prairie as a part of its life cycle. In the spring, they come out of their hibernaculum, and that's where they spend the winter. They mate. The males leave the prairie, and they bask on the prairies in the spring. Summer comes, they mate. The males go to the timber. The rabid females stay on the prairies, have their babies, In the fall, they all come back to the prairies, bask. In the winter, they go underground. And one that is a new find for ours is this little guy. Doesn't look like much, but this is the rusty patch bumblebee. This is a bumblebee that is a federally endangered species. Got put on the endangered species list, I think, in like 2017, 18, somewhere in there. Rusty patch bumblebees used to be very, very common in Iowa, in the Midwest. They believe that their population has been reduced by 90%. Big decrease. But here in Jackson County area, we still have them. So I have been helping out some of the folks from the Fish and Wildlife Service to try to look on Jackson County properties where the rusty patch bumblebee is, if we have it, to help them figure out where these animals still exist and how can we help them. And the cool thing is, I'm finding them on our properties, and I'm finding them on the remnant prairies. This is one of those pollinators that is using that rich, diverse flower source for its nectar. It's very cool. So I'm very excited to get back out there this coming spring and summer and fall. But I documented them on 4 of our different properties this last summer. It's really cool to see. And other things that I'm doing, seed collection. I am trying to collect seed off the remnant prairies that I can reseed areas of those prairies that we cut trees and junk out of, so I can keep local eco-type genetic seed on those sites. I don't really want to bring in seed, prairie seed from Texas or something that really that wasn't adapted to be in your climate, blah, blah, blah. But so I'm trying to do some more seed collection off of our remnant prairie plants so I can put them back on our remnant prairies. And engaging students. One of my things that I do as a naturalist, besides land management stuff, is education in some capacity. So this will be my 3rd or 4th summer now, and bringing out local high school and a few university students out to these spots. Students that are old enough that are interested in conservation and botany and ecology, taking them out to spots that I can't take little kids out to because it's too steep and rocky in summertime, and doing things like teaching them plant ID skills, teaching them about ecology, and exposing them to these really rare, unique, sensitive areas. Oop, there we go. So other things we're doing is we are on our properties where there aren't remnant prairies trying to restore prairies, planting prairies where prairies probably once were, back into a cool prairie ecosystem. It's not as diverse as a remnant prairie, but it is better than not having a prairie where we're talking about habitat and ecology and ecosystem services. And to finish things out, I know I talked and rambled at you a whole heck of a lot, but I'm going to show you a few pretty pictures of remnant prairies because I think the aesthetics of the prairie, especially remnant prairies, can really help garner appreciation for them. This is a really cool plant. This is called downy painted kelp. It's a cousin to Indian paintbrush, if you're familiar with that one. Here is one of the best remnant prairies in Jackson County and all of Iowa. It's not on county conservation land. This is owned by Dr. Ray Hamilton out there in the eastern part of the county. Some of the best stuff for remnant prairies in Iowa is out of Hamilton's Prairie. And we do public prairie walks out there throughout the summer. And this is one of them that you can actually drive to. You don't need to hike up a mountain to get to it. Does anyone know what this one is?
Coneflower.
Yeah, pale purple coneflower, yeah. And our butterfly milkweed in the back. This is a cool one. This is actually not in Jackson County. This is just outside the Jones County line. This is out at Hamilton-Tamkin Prairie. It's managed by Jones County. This is mid-May, just covered in shooting star, wild columbine, hoary cocoon. Here's our Indian paintbrush. This is out of Ozark Wildlife Area. With this really cool yellow flower behind it that's called two-flower cynthia. It's a wild. It's almost like a dandelion, but it's not a dandelion. Cool. Thank you.
So, will you tell a story of Dr. Hamilton's coneflowers and how he thinks they came?
Yep, so Doc Hamilton is, I would consider him my plant mentor. He's one of the people that really got me interested and involved in remnant prairies, got me on the board for the Iowa Prairie Network. And so Dr. Hamilton did a lot of work to identify areas that had like remnant integrity to them. Really back in the 80s and 90s, he did a lot of work on remnant prairies. algific talus slopes, which is a different talk for a different day, but also equally as cool and unique. But Doc Hamilton bought this property out there. If you know where Codfish Hollow is, where they have the concerts, it's right across the road. So the story goes, back in the 80s, Doc and his wife were driving around looking for areas in the county that might have remnant stuff. And he saw this, a couple little spots in this field where it was open. You can tell there was native plants on it. And then back during the farming crisis in the 80s, he purchased this property. And he went in and he thought maybe there'd be a spot where there's a remnant hilltop. He found 12 remnant hilltops. This farm, very rocky. They rock at the surface level. Here in Iowa, we have dirt. This spot, we have rocks. So it never got plowed. It probably was grazed historically, even by domestic cows, which to a certain degree probably was a good thing for this prairie to keep it open, to keep woodies and invasives off of it. Then what he did is, since the 80s, took out unwanted invasive species, took out unwanted plants, and he's pretty much created this this mosaic of remnant and restored prairies. He does have a restored prairie out at this site, but all the restored parts of the prairie is from seed that he hand collected off the remnant hilltops or off remnant prairies in a 15-mile radius. So all those native plants that are in there are like Jackson County. That's like our natural history. This is what Jackson County looked like when the pioneers first came in, back when buffalo were still there, right? So there is a number of, I mean, the diversity of flowers and plants out there is staggering, but there are rare, endangered species out there as well, like the rusty patch bumblebee. I'm assuming, I haven't found it there yet, but I bet it's out there. The regal flitterary, which is a threatened butterfly species, the monarch butterfly, which was once common and is going to be listed as endangered here in the next few years. The list goes on and on and on. And yeah, it's just amazing out there. And there's a ton of, in the early summer, the echinacea, the pale purple cone flowers. You can see it out there, and it's absolutely beautiful. Yes, sir.
Now, I was noticing, did the conservation, I mean, obviously not Jackson County, but the Conservation Board, when did they decide to designate I-35 as the?
Oh, I'm not sure. I do not know, but I should look that up. Yeah, yes it is. That's a great question.
Do monarchs actually, kind of like we go at 70 miles an hour, do they actually travel that way?
So they might not travel down the corridor in a straight line and not following the road, but along I-35, they did a lot of native prairie plantings in the road right away. So as you're driving, let's say through the Ames area, it is like the road ditches are prairie, and it's awesome. And so monarchs are utilizing that for nectar sources. Milkweed is their host plant, so they're using the milkweed to rear young. So that's a big part where they designated that. They're not necessarily just like, they don't know where to necessarily, but they probably are attracted to those native plants to some degree. Yeah, good question. Yes, ma'am.
Does it seem overwhelming trying to, with the remnant prairies, trying to get them back to the way they were? It just seems like, with the, do you have enough people to get it done? It's
overwhelming and rewarding. Like, doing this kind of work is what fills my cup, which gets me really excited. And it's cool, there's always work to do. The overwhelming part is when we don't have enough staff or funds, or people aren't as gung-ho about it as I am, kind of thing. You know what I mean? So but it can be a little overwhelming at times, but we're getting going when we're out there. It is awesome, and I need to incorporate like the response to some of these areas where we have been doing woody release, taking invasives out, and how that prairie is responding, what it looks like. That's a whole talk in and of itself, but it is really cool to see the work we've already done and the direction that we're on, which is good, which is exciting for me.
So, do you have like volunteer groups to help
Right.
with more remnant prairies, etc.?
Right. I have taken volunteers at some of these sites, and I am not the best at like organizing volunteers, though I want to be better at it. One of the challenging things for the remnant prairies is most of them are like a big old hike in up a bluff, and that isn't always like an attractant to volunteers. I do have volunteers once in a while, but it's not like all the time. But it happens. I want more of it to be better at it, but it is it's a hefty thing to ask of people. You know what I mean? So, but we do some volunteering when it comes to these things. Any other questions?
Chuck Jorgensen talks about the goat prairies.
Yeah.
You want to tell us a couple things about that?
Yes. So the goat prairies, these prairies, but I call them the bluff prairies or hill prairies. Those are also called a kind of a nickname for them is the goat prairie. So I'll try a good picture of one. Here we go. So a goat prairie is a remnant bluff prairie that we find here in this area, the driftless area and stuff. And these goat prairies sit along rivers on super steep rocky terrain, and they have like the southern southwest exposure that kept them dry and sunny. They call them goat prairies as kind of a joke because it's they're so steep only a mountain goat can climb them. So that's why they call them goat prairies. But the same thing as a bluff prairie. Yeah, good question.
If we were to plant a tree like on our property, what would you recommend that is a scarce tree that we need to get more of?
I don't know if you need a scarce tree, but I'm always a big fan of oaks. Oaks, you know, a native oak species that was found here. Though they might not be rare, oaks host so many insect species that are like a big part of our ecosystem. If it's like an upland dry site, I say oaks. In some capacity. Bur oaks are my favorite, but you know, the native oak tree goes a long way. They take forever to grow, but that's a good thing. I mean, they could be there for, I mean, proper conditions, close to 1,000 years with the right species. So,
Tony, what's the white flower there in the foreground?
Yep. This white flower in the foreground is called flowering spurge. That's one of the legumes, so it's related. It's in the bean and pea family. There's a ton of legumes in the native prairie. So this plant, just like lead plant, we saw it earlier, you know, the legumes, soybeans are legumes. They are nitrogen fixers. Most plants take nitrogen out of the soil and use it because it's a nutrient that plants use. Legumes, I can't quite explain it the best way, but they take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and with a special fungus on the roots, and they actually put nitrogen back in the soil in a form that plants can uptake. So yeah, that's all flowering spurge, long story short.
It seems like it's all over in our pasture.
It could be, and some pastures will still have prairie plants in them for whatever reason. But yes, that would be one that
chemical that'll kill it.
A chemical that'll kill it. I'm not into killing native plants, so I'm not going to
So historically, the area, I think maybe between the forks of the Maquoketa River, that was known back in the day as the Big Woods.
Okay, yes.
Can you?
So the Big Woods, oh man, we go way back. Yes, so here in eastern Iowa, we had more, when it comes to the whole state, we had more savanna and woodland in eastern Iowa.
Okay.
So the Big Woods was an area that was woods, and you know, as far as I understand it, as people came into Iowa, you know, where there was woods was mostly prairie, where there was woods. They called it Big Woods because it was a big chunk of woods compared to the rest of the surrounding landscape. So it makes sense that the Big Woods is there at the forks of Maquoketa, because historically our woodlands and savannas were found along the waterways because there was more moisture, there was more water for them to uptake. Because trees need more water than prairie does, right? So the Big Woods is this chunk right here, more or less. So it was probably more of a open woodland savanna system than it is today. When we think of woods that we have today, they haven't seen grazing or fire necessarily in a natural way in a long time. So historically our woodlands were a lot more open grown savanna-like. But yes, where the fork of the Maquoketa River is, it's wet, there's water, it's hilly, there's shade, so it allowed a woodland to naturally occur versus a prairie. But yeah.
And,
Yes.
sorry.
Sure.
What about, so you talked in the beginning about oaks and hickory.
Yes.
Are there many hickories left What?
Yep, so we have some native hickories, shagbark hickory, bitternut hickory, I think they call it hognut hickory too. They're out there. They are upland trees. They're upland trees. You don't find them down the river bottom necessarily. You find them up in the hill. They like drier soil. They like sunlight. So when it comes to oaks and savannas, oaks and hickories, we aren't seeing in this area as much regeneration of oaks and hickories in the interior of a forest, because most of our woodlands that we have in Iowa now are mature woodlands. They are shaded out, where naturally they were getting elk and bison coming through, they had fire going through, they were a much open, sunnier ecosystem. So, you know, settlers come in, we stopped wildfire, we got rid of the elk and bison. In our open forests and savannas, without that disturbance, other plants that are a little better at growing in the shade started creeping in. And then plants like maples and ironwood and hackberry, other native trees, but the ones that are really shade tolerant, were allowed to come in. And they grew up and they outcompeted the oaks. And now in the interior of most of our woods, it associated out that oaks and hickories don't have the proper sunlight to regenerate. So a lot of times you see oaks and hickories on the edge of a timber lot because they get some of that sunlight. Or in a spot like one of our savannas where there's plenty of sunlight, so you see the lady oaks and hickories popping up. Yeah.
And then how about butternuts? Because back in the day when everybody went out and gathered nuts in the fall, nuts, butternuts.
I can't 100% speak to a butternut, but I think they are related to hickories. If I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong, but my guess is they are probably also a plant species that needs a lot of sunlight.
Kind of.
Yeah. And we're not allowing that sunlight into our woods because most people aren't going out and running fire through it or things like that. Letting the bison eat it down, right? Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for letting me come out. I appreciate it. If anyone wants to ask any more questions before I leave, please do so. I do have some books up here. If there's my favorite books, if you want to look at titles that kind of talk about the natural history of Iowa to some extent, you can look at them, write them down. I'm not giving them out. They're my personal ones, but I do have a few native plant handouts up here if anyone is interested.
Thank you, Tony, so very much.
Thank you.
How many people agree with the